Dear Professor Vergès, honorable guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, as Deputy Director of the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, I feel honored to welcome the 4th Berlin Southern Theory Lecture in our premises, and I thank the Institute of Social and Cultural Anthropology as well as the Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient for the organization of this important event. I'm extremely happy that finally we are able again to house this lecture here in these wonderful buildings after 2 years of online exile due to pandemic situation. Here, in the former exhibition spaces of the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art, together with partners from the still active Museum of European Cultures, the Institute of Museum Studies, and other institutions, we are making plans for the future. In these premises, we are currently building the Research Campus Dahlem, and on the 7th of October this year, we opened to the public for a day of presentations and workshops, and we intend to continue with opening steps in the months to come. In these spaces, we will probe new approaches in dealing with the multifaceted collections of the museums in cooperation with diverse partners such as the Free University, as well as international academic and non-academic experts. When the Ethnological Museum and the Museum of Asian Art opened their exhibitions in the Humboldt Forum last September, a large group of international partners was present, almost 80 specialists from diverse backgrounds and from many countries of the world. During 10 days, they did not only meet us, but also they met with each other, and as a result of 4 workshops, they produced a paper with the title Dignity, Continuity, Transparency. It highlights their wishes for the future work of the Humboldt Forum, especially regarding the collections from the museums. It can be found on the Humboldt Forum homepage, where you can have a look at it and read it. To adjust our structures to these needs and more generally to new demands on museum practice, we have started a large-scale project with the title The Collaborative Museum. During the next 3 years, we will invite guests to work on the collections and at the same time help us become better in meeting their demands to become a more transparent, inviting place and a platform for multivocal exchange. This, of course, reaches beyond the walls of museum buildings and addresses the society as a whole. A much wider decolonization process has to take place, and that is why we are here today. I very much look forward to the presentation of Professor Vergès, and now hand over to Abdoulaye Sounaye from the Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient for further introducing remarks. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to be long. Just want to say a few words when it comes to debating, engaging, and talking about theory, especially when we call it Southern theory. This is an intellectual venture, I have to say, which has been very fruitful, I would say. This is the 4th lecture, and we could even add today that one of the lectures has come out in the form of a publication. So it's not just a lecture, but it's also a publication series. Please look for that publication by Patarma Banerjee, which just came out. It's online. Talking about theory, especially when we say Southern theory, the idea, if I can put it that way, is basically to take theory within and beyond its historical frontiers. Its self-proclaimed professionals and to open to diverse kinds of theory, but also developing sensitivity to non-classical and other modes of theorizing. So it's not just about acknowledging the value and the worth of theory per se. but very much about the valuation and valorization of the diversity within the modes and forms of thinking or rethinking the world, as the title of a recent book put it. I would like to point here, since we are at our fourth lectures, perhaps there is something to talk about or to think about in terms of the future of theory, especially when we say again, Southern theory. Theorizing from the South, what does it mean? What does it lead to? South, not just a geographical location, but also a socio-political condition and position. As we all know, epistemic regimes, orders, and relations are very much political. That makes it even more important to reflect on how do we work on theory, how the work of theory actually happens. From where, with whom, and for what. I hope the fourth one that is happening tonight will give us additional insights into the ways in which theory matters, but also the ways in which we relate epistemologically to each other. On this note, I would like to hand it to Sandra. Thank you very much.
So I'm kind of losing my voice, but just to let you know, we do have a backup plan for that. But now I'm extremely delighted to be able to introduce you, Françoise Vergès. So in preparing my remarks here, I really was wondering how to introduce someone to you with such an extremely impressive and wide-ranging career. You've been a professor, a journalist, an activist, a filmmaker, storyteller, and artist. But what I learned about Françoise Vergès is that she isn't very comfortable with the term career at all. She uses it in scare quotes. And strikingly, for someone as accomplished as she is, she very modestly asked me to keep this introduction short. Or very endearingly, she said, "The less you say, the better." I will have to disappoint you a little bit, and I want to say a little bit about your work, but I will try to be as brief as I can. And I just want to help you a little bit to understand really what motivates Françoise Vergès' work. And really a red thread that runs through all of her practice is a very deep commitment to anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and feminist concerns. So growing up on Réunion Island, as the child of anti-colonial, communist, and feminist parents, she experienced firsthand how race, gender, and class intersect in a French post-colony. And this profoundly shaped her thinking, and is also very closely reflected in her book, The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, Feminism, that was published with Duke University Press, and that examines abortion and forced sterilization campaigns during the 1960s on Réunion Island. And it's also work that was, something that happened that was ignored by French feminism. And after a period in Algeria, she moved to France and worked as a journalist and editor, and then in the 1970s became involved in feminist and anti-racist movements. In the 1980s, she then moved to the US to further her education and received a BA in Women's Studies and Political Science at San Diego State University, and completed a PhD in Political Theory at Berkeley. So receiving this education, and also importantly, educating herself through her activism and her experiences as someone from the Global South, really helped her in fomenting important critiques of French and more broadly what she calls civilizational feminism, which completely ignores race and overlooks the situation of women in the Global South. So here she really became one of the most important voices in articulating an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and decolonial feminism. And here two very noteworthy publications are A Decolonial Feminism and A Feminist Theory of Violence, which both appeared in English with Pluto Press. However, Françoise Vergès has never restricted herself only to the scholarly ivory tower, but she's always sought other modes of public expression and engagement. For example, she was president of the French National Committee for the Remembrance and History of Slavery. She co-founded the nonprofit Decolonizing the Arts. She organized seminars in Reunion Island with psychiatrists and activists, convened workshops with artists and activists. She's made films, narrated stories through visual and sonic performances. And through all of this, she remains deeply committed to anti-capitalist and decolonial feminist concerns. So just to say, we're extremely pleased you're here, Françoise. A really warm welcome to you, and we very much look forward to your lecture.
Good evening. Thank you for a very generous introduction. As Sandra said, I don't like so much to be, I don't know, it's always as if we are talking about someone else. And so, because so many things are not being said. For instance, that I like to cook. I'm much more interested in cooking than writing book, but I know that's not part of the persona that you have to present. So anyway, good evening. As Sandra said, everything, all my work, all my research is really anchored in the aspiration for emancipation and liberation of all people. And the constant understanding, explaining how consent to exploitation, racism, sexism is being built, how this consent is being obtained and naturalized and normalized, and therefore how dissent is being also constructed and created constantly against that. This is really, so for me, it's a constant curiosity. Nothing is really fully explained for me. There is always an event, something happening that mean for me to revise what I am thinking or to understand better what is happening, why this is happening, what are the forces behind it, how can we stop it, what are the forms of resistance. So tonight my talk is still, this approach. The world is not doing very well. We witness the rise of fascistic movement, of anti-state politics, of authoritarianism, racial capitalism, systemic destruction of the condition of living for human and non-human life, the economy of extraction, dispossession, exploitation, exhaustion, and suffocation being the daily condition for billions of people, mainly living in the global south. A war is being waged on European soil, but wars continue to be waged in the global south. Anti-black racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism are normalized. Meanness and cruelty are banalized. Poor, black, indigenous, and brown people have lost jobs and homes, are getting sick. Migrants and refugees are being hunted, chased, and killed. Women are being murdered. Prisons are overcrowded. People are fleeing devastating hurricane, flood, and fire. People are being starved. The COVID-19 pandemic unleashed an economic storm that hit the poor and vulnerable hardest, with women and marginalized workers facing the worst of job loss. More than 100 million have already been pushed into extreme poverty. Women in the global south and women of color in the north are bearing the heavier burden of the current crisis, plural. Indeed, nearly 40% of all women employed globally work in the four most affected industries by the pandemic: hotel, restaurant, retail, and manufacturing. They account for more than 75% of all unpaid care work in the world. They constitute the majority of workers in the cleaning industry, and notably in social services, they are 90%. And with girls, they dedicate roughly 12.5 billion hours to unpaid work every day. Due to the overload of domestic work, 42% women in the world are excluded from what we call the labor market, compared to 6% of men. Add to all this what Achille Mbembe called the new hegemony of algorithmic reason, the power of billionaires to shape policies, and it is not wonder we may feel overwhelmed, facing a terrible and unstoppable machine of destruction. We are living through a humanity crisis, as curator Bonaventure Sir Beigel has said. And yet, there is not a day, when we are not witnessing upheaval and resistance. The feminist revolution in Iran, general strike, march, protests everywhere. It is in this context that I propose tonight to speak of a program of total disorder and of decolonizing Europe. A program of total disorder is taken from Frantz Fanon's remark in The Wretch of the Earth, and I quote, "Decolonization, which set out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of total disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor of a natural shock, nor of a friendly understanding." I have to say that the English translation says complete disorder, but I think that total disorder is closer to the French version, which is le désordre total, because it better reflects Fanon's thought of totality rather than completeness. But that was just an aside. What Fanon meant was that decolonization is neither a metaphor nor a performance, but a historical, cultural, and social process that requires determination and commitment. When he said that it could not be the result of friendly understanding, he was challenging the illusion that oppressor would, in good faith, accept to renounce power and hegemony. Decolonization, then, is long and a difficult process. It has not happened yet, and we do not know which world will emerge from decolonization. We do not know because we have no model. Fanon's decolonization was not only about shattering the anti-blackness that has organized the world since the 15th century, but also about renouncing the ideas of redemption, renouncing rigid vision of revolution, whether black, remember that he criticized negritude, or anti-colonial. Even though he wrote in a very Christian way, the last will be the first, but we could discuss about, paradox. It is not about the total resolution of conflict, therefore, but the end of this world, which is not the end of the world. It is the end of an order that had produced and is producing intense suffering, destruction, war, suffocation, exploitation. Decolonization is difficult because we must check centuries of dispossession and exploitation, and also what century of patriarchy and racism has put in our own mind. It means also confronting what is irreparable. The fact that decolonization will not lead to the full repair of centuries of damage, exploitation, extraction. The irreparable is not, however, a condemnation to nostalgia and melancholia. It implies a politic of what artist Kader Attia has called fragment of repair. Attia proposed the decolonial repair as a tactic to engage with planetary urgency of collective mental health in relation to the material and immaterial injustices of colonial violence that persist into the present. Repair, we know, comes from the Latin reparere, which means to restore, to put back into order. It's the act of restoring, of restoration after decay, What kind of restoration is possible then when the decay accumulated since colonial slavery has reached an amount we cannot even measure? What is irreparable? What has been so damaged that it cannot be mended? In an interview I made in 2004, Aimé Césaire said that colonial slavery was irreparable. He was even suspicious of a politic of reparation because he will conclude with chapter close, move on. His ancestors, he say, had not come freely to Martinique, but in the hold of the slave ship. They had been kidnapped, terrorized, and thrown naked onto the shore of a land they did not know. They had no clue about its language, culture, social organization. They were made into objects. They were denied the right to make kinship, family, community. They entered the master house, the world it made, and the world which had made it. They dream of dismantling it, and they imagine the tools that will do it. They never stop fighting. The archive of their struggle constitutes a fragment of repair. So to imagine fragment of repair, we need also to make a leap of imagination, create the apparatus that will operate the temporal rupture with the age of predation, exhaustion. Fragments, because the repair will never be complete, because total wholeness is unattainable and not something to wish for. We must learn to live with the irreparable, to live with its scars, and to live with the grammar of hope, of radical hope. We must also acknowledge that some of us will not be repaired, will be lost, because for them trauma and damage are impossible to bear. They have thought even of suicide, practice of automutilation or violence onto others are the only ways to deal with the violent and daily ritual of racial sexist humiliation and with a violent encounter within society or within heteropatriarchal family. We must then to offer to these some solace, aware of the destructive power upon the psyche of racism, homophobia, systemic violence, of all this economy that depletes the body and the mind. About repair, I wrote in April 2021, we are still in lockdown, and I quote, "The virus has revealed an injured world in unmistakable need of reparation. This reparation, however, must not be a seamless return to the original state of deep social, economic, ecological, and economic injustice. On the contrary, repair is about shaping a possibility of emerging into another reality, into another more just world. Yet, much of the imprint of the current pandemic disaster is irreparable, seeing the tragic loss of lives, but also the exhausted lives that, due to colonial violence and injustice, barely survive. In the context of irreparable repair, we must draw a decolonial strategy as a means of repair in spite of exhaustion, of amplifying moment of joyful survival and beautiful experiment through the brokenness. This may sound perhaps also like wishful thinking, but the question remains. How do we put an end to the economy of exhaustion, of mental and bodily depletion that is endemic to racial capitalism? Capitalism is a structurally unequal economic system founded on extractivism that produces a constant exhaustion of all forms of living, human and animal, soil and subsoil, ocean and river, and water, for the well-being of a few. To imagine decolonial repair, we must need, I say, to make a leap of imagination, to create the apparatus that will operate the temporal rupture with the age of predation, exhaustion. Final thought, so this is, this question of repair that I wanted to bring forward. What pathway, can repair? Not a return to past ways, but an itinerary shaped by demand for decolonization and the politic of restitution. Fanon thought that total disorder will come from the global source, what was called then the Third World. Europe to him was a lost cause. In the conclusion of The Rush of the Earth, he wrote, I quote, "Leave this Europe where they are never done talking of men, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own street, in all the corners of the globe. Europe has declined all humility and all modesty, but she has also set her face against all solicitude and all tenderness." And he added, I quote, "All the elements of the solution to the great problem of humanity have at different times existed in European thought. But Europeans have not carried out in practice the mission which fell to them, which consisted of bringing their whole weight to bear violently upon this element, or modifying their arrangement and their nature, of changing them, and finally, of bringing the problem of humankind to an infinitely higher plane. Europe has betrayed its own aspiration, But to save Europe, Fanon argued, and I quote, if we wish to reply to the expectation of the people of Europe, it is not good sending them back a reflection, even an ideal reflection of their society and their thought, with which from time to time they feel immeasurably sickened. A decade earlier, Aimé Césaire had written in Discourse of Colonialism, which was first published in 1950, that, I quote, Europe is morally, spiritually indefensible. To Césaire, I quote, each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a little girl is raped and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured and in France, they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight. A universal regression takes place. A gangrene sets it. A center of affection begins to spread. And at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive exhibitions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners that have been tied up and interrogated, all these patriots who have been tortured, at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, of all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been instilled into the vein of Europe, but slowly and surely the continent proceeds towards savagery. So Césaire and Fanon had the same conclusion. Europe was lost. Europe needed itself to return, to absolutely shake itself to enter a process of decolonization. The question of savagery was an important argument among the anti-colonialists. The savagery that Europeans saw in non-European people was in fact the projection of their own savagery. Colonialism and imperialism boomerang effect, what Césaire called the boomerang effect, was inevitable. Racism would penetrate European laws, philosophy, art and culture, political organization. Even progressive ideology, feminism, socialism, and so on would be permeated by racial thinking. What the French called the civilizing mission, the duty to civilize, to teach hygiene, private property rights, norms about motherhood, fatherhood, or family, and which was consolidated in the 19th century, became European thinking. It emerged as developed in the 15th century with slave trade. But the idea of Europe that emerged, a transformation in some state, the small part of what is called Europe, the West, into a continent apart from the vast landmass in which they stood, was very important. To invent that continent, that Europe was a continent in itself. The 18th century, the age of liberal revolution, was also that moment of consolidating Europe as an idea, was also the age of the flourishing slave trade and the expansion of colonial slavery. As we know, in 18th century, more Africans were deported than any other century before. In 17th century, the deportation was 40 to 50,000 Africans. In 18th century, we moved to 70 to 90,000 per year. And this was never, it never reached such a number. And that was the age of the French, American, and English Revolution, and the age of, a liberal principle of human rights. So this was the moment of the idea of Europe that was consolidated. At the same time, the invention of a continent with shared values, Christian values, with a shared interest, despite some rivalry, despite some, competition, and the idea also that, and the practice of slave trade and slavery. The Treaty of Utrecht in mid-18th century affirmed the principle of the balance of power and diplomacy among states, but it also clearly stated that slave trade and colony were essential to the wealth of Europe. This was in the treaty. It was, in fact, interesting that in 2013, when the Europe community celebrated the Treaty of Utrecht of 1753, they did not talk about that part of the treaty. They talk about mostly, that construction that emerging idea of a federation of European states that will lead to the European community in 20th century. They never talk about that part of the treaties that absolutely insisted on the fact that slave trade had to be maintained and, of course, the exploitation of the colony. The economic geography of Europe, the capital of it was reaffirmed. The philosophy behind the Treaty of Utrecht, the invention of Europe, as I say, and the duty even to enlighten the world, which was introduced, will continue to inform poets, politicians, and philosophers throughout the 19th century. Thus, when in 1945, in a Europe in which the memory of World War II, of the Nazi genocide against the Jews, the Roma, and people of Europe were shaping the way in which justice, crime, democracy were thought, but also Europe with colonial empire were crumbling and colonies were fighting for their independence, in the context of the emergence of the Cold War that split Europe in two, Western power decided to form a federation based on that old vision. Indeed, as P.O. Hansen and Stefan Johnson have shown in their book Euro-Africa, The Colonial Origin of the European Union, the narrative of a peaceful federation here hid a continuum. In the interwar period already, Richard Caudron-Kalergi, who was a champion of the pan-European movement, and many of contemporaries, had argued that the condition for European salvation rested on making the African continent the leaven of European unity. European ability to exploit the wealth of the African colony. They had to do that to compete with the rising power of the American and Asian continent. Euro-Africa, they call it, will become the dominant pole of global politics. The Euro-African project, once cherished by fascist regime, rose therefore from the ashes after 1945 and inspired the founder of Europe, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, Paul-Henri Spaak, and Konrad Adenauer. The French state, then the remaining main colonial power in colonial Europe, played an essential role in that construction, making the inclusion of the African colony in the European common market a sine qua non condition for its participation in European integration. The rhetoric of peace, cooperation, and democracy mask the continuing economy of exploitation and extraction of African resources. European peace and wealth rested on the externalization of war and the exploitation of black people. For many decades, in fact, when Europe lived in peace, France, Belgium, UK, and other, colonial power were waging war in Indochina, Palestine, Cameroon, Kenya, Algeria, and so on. Its power engaged in military intervention, supported military coup and dictatorship, accepted the presence of military dictatorship in Spain, Greece, and Portugal. The Cold War was never cold in the global South. The amelioration of the condition of living for Western Europeans in the second half of the 20th century, their imperial way of living, explain as the result of European quality and the ideal of progress, ignore the role of extraction of African resources, the immigrant workforce, and of how the weapon industry that exported war and torture contributed to the wealth of Europe. Thus, what has changed since Fanon and Césaire remark? If Europe is indefensible, what decolonization is possible? But this question must be asked in a context of weaponization of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism by authoritarian government. How do we actualize the argument of Fanon and Césaire? We know that Césaire, Fanon, but also Amilcar Cabral, Walter René, and others had all foreseen the betrayal of the national bourgeoisie in the global south, what they call the national bourgeoisie. They had warned about a fake, artificial, anti-Western discourse that will serve to reinforce conservatism, attack on minority, on workers, on women, on LGBTQE, on sex workers. This weaponization by, does not mean we must renounce anti-imperialism. On the contrary, we must clarify what we mean. We must also recognize in this anti-Western rhetoric the fact that for many states, the desire to be seen as equal is very strong. I'm not justifying the weaponization by saying that. I'm just saying that it is not surprising. The decline of Western hegemony is not something to lament. What is needed is rigorous analysis of the multiplicity of conflict that has been arisen, and a greater interest for new form of transnational struggle for environmental justice, reproductive justice, decolonial feminist movement, and so on. And as anti-colonial movement in Europe in the 1960s understood that anti-colonialism brought progress for emancipation and liberation in Europe, today, anti-imperialist struggle outside of Europe Europeans must understand that it brings for them also more ideas of liberation and emancipation. Decolonization thus has to be constantly clarified what we mean by that, what is anti-imperialist decolonization. Because as Catherine Walsh has warned us, the term is increasingly, used rhetorically, and, even lightness, it's commodified as a property of a group and individual, as a new canon of thought, both of which erase and shroud decoloniality terrain of political project, praxis, and struggle. Indeed, what do we see today in Europe? But the word decolonization everywhere. Museum, magazines, symposia embark on decolonial movement, journal, edition, roundtable, everywhere, T-shirt, everyone want to decolonize and is, So it's important to scrutinize the danger of the notion, the commodification of that notion, institutionalization or dilution. So this is very important to understand what do we mean and to constantly clarify the word, because the fact that this word is constantly commodified is not human. This is like part of capitalist rhetoric. It's very important it's part even of the logic of colonization of, you constantly have to appropriate things. This is the constant expansion that many theorists of capitalism have remarked. So this is not the fact that, cry over the fact that decolonization is now institutionalized. That's not the point. It's like to constantly clarify what is the decolonization we are talking about. And in that decolonization, of course, the question of race and racialization is central. Because the reality of racialization, produced in no small measure out of the history of colonialism and slavery, shaped today the European reception of migrant and refugee, who are persistently marked as other, as not belonging, as unintegrable. But what is the house in which race rule? What is the house that race produce? We are still living, then I will argue, in the age of the man capital, whom Caribbean philosopher Sylvain Winter, using Frantz Fanon's theory of sociogenesis, defined as a formulation of European representation of the human which epistemologically foreclose way of being human otherwise. The Colombian encounter of 1492, she said, was vital to this invention. And Winter called for excavating the form of humanness disavowed by the exclusionary category of men and had, I quote, all our present struggle with respect to race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, struggle over the environment, global warming, severe climate change, the sharply unequal distribution of the Earth's resources, belong to the struggle between the ethno-class, what she called the ethno-class men, capital M, and human. We are not yet in the age of the human. There is no end to murder, no end to anti-blackness, anti-indigeneity, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and femicide. So how do we repair, how do we colonize a world that feeds on the wounds, damage, harm, grief, and trauma it produces? A world whose very survival depends on their perpetuation. What kind of disorder should we bring into that world? That world, that house is a house is a master house, whose structure and architecture, emerged during colonial slavery. I'm not suggesting an unchanged spatial and cultural arrangement, but the existence of a form, of an architecture that connects different nodes of power and whose accumulation of wealth is based on the economy of extraction and exhaustion. It is a world that produces enormous amount of wasted land and wasted life. Its powers rest on pacification, neutralization, and terror, on the interdiction to make community and family outside of the heteronormative and patriarchal norms. Its wars leave behind wounds, trauma, distress, and dread, and mental suffering that lasts through generations, as well as tons of junk whose polluting capacity linger for generations. Its laws of protection of women and children enforce the division between those who deserve protection and those who do not. The master house is no longer exclusively found in the global north. Its architecture is replicated in the enclave for the wealthy that we find in cities throughout the world, in the sheer logic of extraction and exhaustion, in the backlash of patriarchy. Thinking about it historically in the present means defining what we call the present. We should not be confused with the contemporary. The present is a position in the way Michel Rolf-Trouillot conceived pastness rather than the past. It is a field of practice that impacts on the way in which we imagine reparative justice and the immunization of the world. We know the remark of Audre Lorde that Audre Lorde made in 1984 about dismantling the master house, which has become source of reflection and debate. The full paragraph read, I quote, "Those of us who stand outside the circle of the society definition of acceptable woman, those of us who have been forged in the crucible of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbian, who are black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to take our difference and make them strength. For the master's tool will never dismantle the master house. They may allow us temporarily to beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change." So to dismantle the master house that is Europe, ask for effectively new tools. Because the master house was also sorry. Sorry. The master house was the home of the men whose wealth and capital accumulation were based on the extraction and exhaustion of mine and silver, or labor in the mine and the plantation of sugar, coffee, indigo, tobacco, and cotton. Colonial mine of silver and gold and plantation led to a reorganization of the world economy and to the impoverishment of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. To mine gold and silver, slavery mined indigenous and black human energy and life force to death. This is what I call the economy of exhaustion, that extraction requires, depleting the force, not only life force, but also depleting the resources of the earth and even today of the deep sea, of everything, It leads to the exhaustion of this resource. It required terror, premature death, and the flesh and bone of indigenous and black dead body mixed with the earth in plantation and in the mine yesterday and today. They are the humus of capitalism. The law of private property, enslavement, and rape became indispensable. Without rape and the capitalization of the black woman womb, the master house would have collapsed. Slavery, Christina Sharp has written, turned the womb into a factory, producing blackness as abjection, much like the slave ship, hold, and the prison. The master house was deeply patriarchal, and yet the laws of private property and whiteness overpowered male domination. White women who were constructed as docile and fragile in the colony, in need of the father, brother, or husband protection, were in fact very savvy and skilled when it came to the commerce in flesh. Since they more often inherited slaves than land, they understood very well that enslaved women were their private capital, and they were careful to deprive their husband of power over that capital. White women, with their understanding of the relation between private property status and capital and the protection they afforded, were the active accomplices of colonial slavery and colonization. And they never expressed any hesitation to enter the slave market in the South and to bargain, to sell and buy human beings without demonstrating any innate female sense of empathy. The gender binary that European states thought to impose was never rigid as it pretended to be. The plantation was a historical form in which the extraction of life, of human and non-human life, was organized on an industrial scale for the production and commodity and profit, Rolando Vasquez has written. The plantation world was limited and limitless. If the world of the plantation was severely enforced for the enslaved, the master needed to have access to the larger world to fructify his capital. Its plantation would have never survived without making, like this, connection with bank and insurance and, the market. Post-slavery capitalism and imperialism continue to use the same tool, the law of private property, the fabrication of disposable life, the transformation in black and brown and indigenous body into a gender carrier of a racial and sexualized message. On hegemony circuit of production, finance and commerce, on the use of the army and police to discipline and punish. Today, the master house and its world are still made possible by the extraction and exhaustion. There are new actors, definitely, but in fact, this is still the same logic. The borders of the world are still heavily guarded by the police or by private guard or by mercenaries, by wall, by the racial, social, and gender segregation of public space. Women of color are still allowed into this world, but always as servants or sexual workers and by the back door. In the current working of the geopolitics of cleanliness, dirtiness, of visibility and invisibility, the invisibility of women of color creates the visibility of clean home and public space. I'm trying to jump. The master house, always also enforce rules to limit the circulation of women, people of color, of vagabond, migrant, and refugee. It financed militia and Maroon Hunter created laws that forbade black, indigenous, and brown presence outside of enclosed neighborhood. A black geography of water and land shows a structural and systemic racism that governs the circulation in black and brown body, whose transgression of border is severely punished. Whereas today, young Western women and men are encouraged to travel and discover the world, to find oneself through a journey abroad, whose travel has been celebrated as adventure, whose travel diary are published, young African, Asian, South American, young Arab from the Middle East, all young men and women are denied their right of circulation and the desire for autonomy. Migrant and refugee who transgress the master border are threatened with death. Where they succeed, they are forced to take illicit jobs in a society which rejects and demean them. They live in the space of unfreedom. And that question of refugee is central for the question of decolonizing Europe. I will just remind ourselves of some, recent fact. In December 2021, thousands of refugees, mostly from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, were wandering through the forest on the Poland-Belarus border in sub-zero temperature. They were beaten, harassed, deported by the border police and private militia on both sides. Babies in their mother's arms were shaking with cold. There was no food, no water, and refugees had to drink water from puddles and eat tree leaves. If they asked for medical help, they were sent back, to zones where soldier, police, and armed militia were harassing them. Those who on the Poland side tried to help them were criminalized. And that is an important fact, because the criminalization of solidarity has become naturalized. From the fishermen in Sicily who are fined because they save people from drowning, to the old ladies in France who are fined because they allow migrants to take a shower or to recharge their phone, to all this gesture, basic human gesture of recognition of humanness are criminalized, and that criminalization says something about the savagery of Europe to quote Aimé Césaire. The Polish government created a war zone along the border to forbid entry to NGO and other human rights associations. Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, expressed full support to the policy of Warsaw and joined European protests, against, the fact that refugees were there. The refugee had no existence in that, pushing back and forth. There were even talk of punishing air flight companies that transported the refugee to Minsk. The Polish government talked of imminent war against the invasion from Belarus. European states weaponized refugees against each other. In winter 2021, also in Bosnia and Herzegovina, hundreds of refugees were stranded in a squalid, burnt-out tent camps as heavy snow fell and temperature plummeted. In the Mediterranean, every day, African and other refugees are drowning. In Italy, they are called residual charges. Camps are multiplying in Europe. Drones, dogs, traps, police violence, rape, all this is a daily occurrence and alert us to the current creation of zone of non-being. The zone when there were no rights, where effectively human beings become non-being. The difference of treatment with Ukrainian refugees, even though everyone deserves refuge, shows the importance of creating and recreating the division between us in Europe and them over there. All European democracies are building, in fact, walls on their border. As Nikos Poulantzas has remarked, capitalism and state apply a structural selectivity among humans. But migrants refuse to see themselves only as victims. In fact, they see themselves as demonstrating courage, bravery, audacity. In an archipelago of solidarity, philosopher Christian Voller recalls how a group of young Senegalese and Cameroonians laughed when she asked them about the difficulty they had endured. They replied by asking her about her own country racism, and they saw themselves as travelers who had overcome huge danger and obstacles thanks to their temerity, their endurance, and their friendship. Their narrative demonstrated collectivity and belonging in practice. Similarly, many of the African women migrant interviewed by sociologist Camille Scholl in The Wretch of the Sea, but the wretch it's in French and it's in the feminine, refused to be seen as victims and challenged the NGO and state norms which wanted to transform them into passive, defenseless, compliant women to be saved in accordance to the philosophy of the civilizing mission. This is not to undermine the suffering, the trauma, the mental health problem of migrants, but to say that the refusal of those who escape a master house, who maroon, to be characterized as victims, show that they comprehend what marooning entails, what is at stake. They take the risk. They transgress the written and unwritten law of the bourgeois state, heteropatriarchy, and the taboo against freedom of circulation. Built on the corpse of the humanist narrative, as poetess Diamond Brown has written, racial capitalism material benefit are not enough to explain the inextinguishable, voracious appetite for colonization of all corners of the planet. What is a future whose very possibility provides strength and courage, desire and joy, a future that does not belong to Western capitalist temporality? What is this future? As decolonial practitioners, we must work with multiple temporality. The past, multiple, that must still be repaired, that still must be, understood. The present, multiple also, that we are repairing as we fight, we resist, we create, and we narrate stories that have been buried, and as we build transnational alliance. And the future that we must already repair from the damage that we are witnessing as we speak, as we are today, together tonight in this room. To this entangled temporality, we cannot think about the future without thinking the past and the present, and we cannot think the past, the afterlife of slavery, without to imagine the future. We add this to this entangled temporality, we must add the temporality of urgency. Someone is drowning, and we must rush to rescue. Someone is thirsty, and we must rush to bring water. Someone is bleeding, and we must rush to stop the bleeding. Someone is crying, we must rush to hold her in our arms. Someone is dying, we must hold her hand and caress her face. And we also must think about the temporality of healing, which is much longer. This entangled temporality demands an effort of conceptual realization. The West does not like entangled temporality. Its past is for glorious remembrance, and its future for glorious living. So, to challenge this idea of the space and time, along the entangled temporality as I talk about, we must add entangled spatiality of repair, the space, skin, muscle, surface, body, mind, social, plant, water in need of repair. It is a difficult exercise that demands a shifting of thought, and again, I insist, of imagination, of letting our mind to go free. Imagining means working within entangled temporality and building the new on the ruin of the past, then transforming the past, in a different way than the West. The past is not a monument and statue that celebrate the army, the state, or the man. We have to remember to open our imagination, and that requires to be open, to accept the unforeseen, the unexpected. But what are we facing into the more and more rapid making of an uninhabitable and irrespirable world? How do we will decolonize that world? Scientific studies abound of the afterlife of West, the abuse of power by corporation, their avidity and avarice that transform everything into shit. Corporations are leading research on recycling and cleaning the world, even though Dubai has announced a plan to invest billion environmental and sustainability initiative. We learned that in the middle of that, we learned that livestock sheep are twice likely to be lost as cargo vessel, leading in one instance 2 years ago to 5,000 cows carcasses lying on the beach in Brazil. We saw, in the last COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, that even the demand by poor country of looking at differentiated responsibility and capacity to resolve, the current crisis, climate crisis, was not listened by rich country. And in the meantime, we learned that indigenous black and brown women and men are suffering in increasing number from skin diseases, from asthma, from cancer, from diabetes, for lung problem, because they live near a waste disposal. They live near wasted land. We understand that wasting environment and lives are deeply entangled into racial capitalism. As Arundhati Roy, I say, I quote, "I think of globalization like a light which shines brighter and brighter on a few people and the rest are in darkness, wiped out. They simply can be seen. Once you get used to not seeing something, that slowly is no longer possible to see it." Decolonizing means learning to see again, learning to see what is under our eyes but we do not see, or when we see it, we don't make anything out of it, we don't understand. Seeing is not enough, consciousness must be there. We need make a jump of imagination to challenge European temporality of emergency that drives us to search for immediate solution rather than dismantling the long work of dismantling the master house. But as Vijay Prashad has written, and I quote, "Better ideas do not by themselves change the world. The suffocation of the dominant force preclude alternative ideas from being taken seriously." So it is this alternative ideas that we have to take seriously. We have to effectively understand what it will mean to decolonize Europe. What does it mean then, How do we jump to that? What is it? How do we will challenge effectively these ideas, this genealogy of a continent, of the invention of a continent, a small part of a vast landmass, its border being more and more militarized and electrified. How will challenge, this irrespirable, the fabrication of irrespirability, which is not just a matter of polluted air, it is also a political strategy against people of color and minority. I can breathe, the word of Eric Garner and George Floyd. I've brought to light the objective of the neoliberal racist politic of imminent death. Level upon level of waste, racism, neoliberalism are asphyxiating the planet and the people. So what do we need to decolonize Europe? And to return to what I say, is it possible? Is Europe still indefensible? I will argue that a certain idea of Europe is still indefensible. And that certain idea of Europe, the Europe built on colonial slavery and colonization, on extraction, and of transforming black, indigenous, and brown lives into waste, is indefensible. It has effectively we have to bring total disorder in that construction. We have also to challenge the idea of a European community still built on extraction and exploitation of black and brown lives. We have to challenge a Europe which still, which is reconstructing itself as white and Christian, closing its border to refugees that have been fabricated by capitalism, by century of capitalism, and by century of wars. Decolonization and decoloniality are and practice. They have to involve the awareness of violence, of the historical and contemporary colonial enterprise that births refugee, and of the multifaceted resistance effected not only by their sheer presence in this space, but also by the sound they make. Decolonization is a way of being, of existing and surviving. In Europe today, and this is why I suggested last August at the Berlin Biennale, in Europe we have to create refuge and sanctuaries. Refuge and sanctuaries in the model of the Underground Railroad, in the model of what some Europeans also created during the anti-colonial war for refuge, a door on which you knock and that open and where you can find some rest, when you will find fake paper, when you will find a warm, bed, and also a warm food. Refuge and sanctuary where you will find, how to survive, when you will be discussed and talk, when there will be, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore called, rehearsal of living, rehearsal of life, the practice of freedom in a world of unfreedom. Decolonizing Europe is possible if we engage in that dismantling of the master house. Because Europe is still this master house, is still that place that is built on the interdiction of the forbidding, of making kinship and community, of closing border, of forbidding circulation, of effectively imprisoning people. It is a Europe, decolonizing Europe will mean fighting racism, absolutely to imagine what will be a post-racist world, a post-patriarchal and a post-capitalist world. We do not quite know, as I say, what it will be because we do not have a model. We do not know yet what it is. And we should not, in fact, have a program of what will be the post-racist, post-capitalist, post-patriarchal society. Because this model, this rigid vision, as Fanon says, are extremely dangerous. On the contrary, we must move on humbly, but with determination on the road, on that journey to decolonization. Decolonization today is solidarity, is transnational solidarity, but it's also solidarity everyday practice of solidarity with refugees, with black women, with women of color, with people of color who are exploited and chased and hunted. It is solidarity with the migrant working in illegal jobs. It is solidarity and not empathy and not humanitarian intervention. Solidarity is something else. Solidarity is being built every day. Solidarity is overcoming difference, is living with difference, is accepting difference. When everything around us, the visual culture that white supremacy, that patriarchy and capitalism has created, tell us that the hegemonic system is as natural as night and day, that what power has called time, history, space is universal, the moment we break that ordering, the moment we tear the curtain that hides the possible, we operate such a rupture that the unjust order waver, literally waver in its construction, its certainty, its symbolic order. We are there entering utopian thinking. And we see how power is afraid of this movement, of that tearing of the curtain, of that program of total disorder. Afraid because repression and censorship are always extremely brutal. Brutality, meanness, and cruelty are increasing with the militarization of the police, the militarization of surveillance. So we must effectively nourish our utopian thinking, the expectation, the future, the foreshadowing of what is not yet, but is an open space, earthly, tangible, and intangible, a time that opens the dawn and that dawns. This is what we must enter to decolonize Europe if we do want Europe to become one among others and not the illusion that upon which a certain Europe, the Europe that Fanon and Césaire condemned. Another perhaps Europe is possible, but that will take effectively a long and difficult journey of decolonization of our mind, of decolonization of our body, of our thinking, decolonization of institutions, of how we learn, of how we teach, how we love, and how we write, how we invent, how we sing, how we write poetry, how we invent museum. Will be really a quite exciting moment, even though it's a very difficult moment. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Françoise. This was a real treat listening to you. And this is also the moment we invite you to the stage, and we invite our two discussants, please, to come to the stage. So I also briefly want to introduce our two discussants. Here, already taking her seat, this is Henrike Kohpeiß, and here we have Fernanda Beigel. We start with Fernanda. Fernanda is a visiting researcher right now at Freie Universität, and she's a sociologist by training, and she has a PhD in political and social science. And she's also chair of the Advisory Committee for Open Science at UNESCO, a principal researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research in Argentina. And there she's also a chair at the National University of Cuyo, and she directs a research center on the international circulation of knowledge. And Henrike Kohpeiß is a postdoctoral researcher at the Collaborative Research Center Affective Societies here at Freie Universität, and she has a PhD in philosophy. And she has a forthcoming book called Bürgerliche Kälte, Affekt und koloniale Subjektivität, which unfolds an effective analysis of the bourgeois subject and engages in an encounter between the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory and Black Studies. Henrike also co-hosts monthly conversations on feelings at the end of the world at the Volksbühne in Berlin, and also engages in artistic collaborations such as dance and performance. But Fernanda, maybe we just start with you, then we have Henrike's comment, and then we let Françoise respond.
Thank you very much. How much time do you think I have? 5?
5 minutes would be great.
Okay, yeah. Just not to go over the time. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. As she said, I'm from Argentina, and particularly a small city which is called Mendoza. And from there, I came here, I must confess, with some concern because I don't work with the concept of decoloniality. And I don't agree mostly with the idea of the decolonial groups in Latin America. And I was really very relieved when I listened to you, because I listened to this tradition of the anti-imperialist decolonization. And when you quoted Catherine Walsh, what I first thought was, well, indeed, I really agree with you and with Catherine that there is a commodification of this notion of decolonization and the decolonial and the banalization, and it is a path also for academic success, maybe in Europe. And so I think discursively it's very powerful, but I've always thought, well, what about the practice? And when you spoke about the practitioners, well, and even at the end, I hope I can say it in these few minutes, I found really a very different path, and I'm so relieved for that. And I just want to say that after that, I heard about Fanon, and I remember, well, maybe decolonization and this decolonial theory could also become, remember what Fanon called the white mask of the black skin. And so how to change that? And first of all, I was thinking on the fact that for us in Latin America, or the Spanish-speaking people, the word decolonial is very difficult because it's in English only. In Spanish, it is descolonial, descolonización. And the problem is that there is a big difference between descolonial and decolonial, and it is used in Spanish. In our dinner last night, we were talking about indigenous. We have the same problem, indígena, and indigenous, which means many things. And so I would like just to bring the name of Aníbal Quijano, because I think that Quijano is a tradition in which I agree completely. He talked about coloniality of power as a diagnosis, as a way of understanding the situation, as a way of understanding the relations of power. But he also proposed the concept of structural heterogeneity. And I would like to ask you if maybe this concept is interesting to describe the power of decolonizing Europe, if it can go to a concrete space as you have described, particularly in a research object that I think it is really truly pertinent to the colonial studies, which is refugee and which is this solidarity. If you think in the concept of decolonial, you're only thinking on the yes or no to the colony or to the decolonization. But on the idea of structural heterogeneity, you're finding a lot of facts and a lot of groups and social actions that are constructing beyond decolonization. So especially in terms of solidarity that you've spoken and refugee, I think that the idea of structural heterogeneity is very interesting to find the path towards the practice of decolonization. And so finally, just to think at the end, the other question is, to what extent do you think that this discussion of decolonizing Europe is a really global discussion? I'm just thinking, well, isn't it really pertinent for Europe? What's the importance for Latin America, for example, of this debate? Or is it pertinent exclusively in terms of the discussion of refugee? We have a discussion in Latin America also in terms of migrants, which is different. But would that be maybe the pertinent discussion for the world? I can't find easily the global scope here. I mean, I find it as a very European discussion. So thank you very much.
I'm also very grateful for the invitation, and thanks, Françoise, for the lecture. There were so many things that I had to think about, and I think I would like to pick up on this idea of the end of Europe that you introduced and presented with Frantz Fanon and Aimé Césaire. Because I agree that it's a fascinating figure of thought, I think, that they bring up when they emphasize over and over again that basically Europe is indefensible and it's a miracle that it still exists, or they pose it as some kind of unlikely event or unlikely fact that it is still there, although there are so many signs of it being in a process of falling apart and of dismantling. And I think that this might be a point that we can maybe think about or unpack a little bit more. Because what are the reasons for Europe to be maintained or to sustain itself, even though it is falling apart in the ways in which you explained, because there are such obvious signs. I wonder how we can make sense of that in the present and also in the colonial past. And I would like to bring up a thought that I find very helpful for that, which is the idea of Jared Sexton and David Martinot that white supremacy is nothing but the series of its occasions and events that hold it stable. So they claim that white supremacy is only the violence that is the series of it being a stable system. But there's no, like in opposition to, I think, other people thinking about white supremacy or whiteness as such, they try to argue that there's no abstract idea that came before all these different instantiations of colonial and, of course, racial violence that connects them, but that we have to understand that the only thing we can refer to are these different events. And I think that this leads us to the question of how can we respond to that? Or what is Europe if it's nothing but the repetition of a series of events that always reintroduce its way of being and its way of articulating itself and its way of executing certain types of violence. I think this can be thought of as, on one hand, kind of an opening idea, because this means that there's nothing of a higher order that has to be dismantled, or that maybe decoloniality doesn't even refer to something of a higher order, but just to what we see in the present. But on the other hand, it also emphasizes the practical level of decoloniality, which you also mentioned and which Fernanda also talked about. And this reminded me of Eve Tuck's article on the fact that decolonization is not a metaphor, or that, what we have to somehow maybe get rid of is the idea that coloniality, or like the colonial order of the world, is mainly an idea that is somehow articulating itself, or that is manifesting in different ways. But it's not the higher order that we should care about. It's like the concrete instantiations that we see every day. And one last thought about this maybe is one about concepts, because then I also had to think about the things you said about decolonization as a concept that is maybe slightly tending to a commodification, and how far that constitutes a problem as well. And I was thinking about the idea that maybe together with Europe's process of decay, or together with all the signs of decay that Europe as like an idea shows, this decay is also present in certain concepts that are, European, humanistic, philosophical concepts that are so dominant, especially in Western philosophy, but of course also in other fields. And I wondered what it would mean to play a little bit with this idea that maybe in order for the series of violent events to end, we will also have to think about the decay of the concepts with which we are used to describe them. Or we have to think about certain types of openness and practices to find a language, or a poetics maybe even, that does not reproduce, I think, the problems that we have understood are somehow not a system or not merely a system, but merely just a reinstantiation of the same kinds of violence over and over again. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for this remark. I'm not close at all to the decolonial theory of Latin America, to all these philosophers. I'm more with the tradition of, closer to what emerged, the South-South connection. I'm not connected to, how can I say, a continentally based theory. I come from a very small places that does not even exist most of the time. So I don't have, for me, I found many of these theorists, totally abstract and not really grounded in struggle. So, but I use decolonization because I'm effectively close to Fanon and César and Cabral and René, and also, some women in the Global South, Aminata Traoré or others. So this is more the way, the decolonization I'm talking about. To what extent decolonizing Europe will be pertinent for the world? It will be pertinent for people living in Europe. And people living in Europe are not only just white people. And, it's not only white people living in Europe. So these people who are European now, who live in Europe, they cannot live in this racist place. So there is a struggle of decolonization within Europe today that, that all this massive migration, and these are the people who are challenging Europe today. It's not coming from outside, it's coming from inside. It's coming really from inside Europe, this challenging of Europe, that we are here now and we will not accept your Europe, your vision. So there will be, what will be the Europe that will emerge? I don't know. Will we be even called Europe? Perhaps it will not be called Europe. There will be, what will be that space that will become decolonized? What will be? This is towards, as I say, Europe is an invention, quite recent, in fact, and which is very, very small part of a vast landmass. It's a very small corner, usually ignoring its south, even. Portuguese philosophy does not matter much, right? Or Finnish either. So it's has been mostly Germany, France, England. So what is called Europe has been that, and remain really the foundation. So it's already constructing its east, its north, its south, and with different level of peripheries and centering. But that Europe, that European community, is not what interests me, that geopolitics. It's really what is happening in terms of new route of solidarity, new understanding of transnational connection, the way in which, for instance, some people, it was used to be called Eastern Europe, as wondering what is their the form of coloniality they have been living, and in which way that can be connected to the experience of coloniality. Yes, no. What is the anti-blackness? How will anti-blackness work? So this is what interests me. One of the other things I will say, there was, I was told by my parents of something that Ho Chi Minh said during the Vietnam War, and about what matter, what kind of struggle matter. Right? So he was receiving Italian communists, a delegation of Italian communists. It was, during really full of the war. And they asked him, so he was asking, what can we do for you? And he explained, the people, all the Vietnamese people, the struggle, American imperialism. What can we do for you? What could we do? And so they repeat the question 2 or 3 times, what can we do for you in that way? How can we help? How can we help? And he answered, you go back to Italy and you do the revolution. This is how you will help the Vietnamese people. So in a way, doing the revolution where you are, contribute to the revolution elsewhere. It's not that it matters, but what happened, for instance, when the woman won in Argentina, it mattered for all women. The struggle in Algeria matters for everywhere, for all the South. It matters, the feminist revolution in Iran is matter today. So in this way, it matters, not in the way that making Europe important, or the decolonization of Europe important, more important. No, it's just part of the larger struggle, of the global struggle. And it's also because you attack the art. One of the art is not the only one, but one of the effectively art of imperialism, of the imperialist thought. So that fortress, you attack that fortress. So in that way, but I'm not saying that it's that this is necessary for the liberation of the rest, but it will contribute. And for me, for instance, even though I agree absolutely with César that Europe is indefensible, I cannot condemn all the people living on that space called Europe. And it's not just, of course, the refugee, but also, all these descendants of migrant people everywhere. I cannot, or the community within, effectively, the nation, which are minority and constructed as minority and being oppressed and colonized. So that these people within Europe, perhaps, this heterogeneity of Europe, perhaps, is because effectively Europe constantly constructs itself as still this idea of Europe, and this idea of that civilizing mission of Europe, this has to be dismantled. And if it's dismantled, it will help, I think. Not help, but it will contribute. If it's also Europe is also, one of the first seller and producer of weapons in the world. Europe. And so if we attack this, if we attack the weapon industry, it will certainly contribute to, the struggle of other people. It's, European gas that are being used in Iraq and elsewhere, in Syria. It's European weapons that are being used here and there, so it's also that. It's not, so of course they are also being sent to Ukraine, but the point is, there are things in Europe, the university, this is still, it still matter what's happening. So we have to dismantle that, because it's been able, nonetheless, to construct itself. Even if it's declining, there is still, it still matter. The fact that France, which is a small country, it's still, sitting at the, Security Council and has a veto voice. This is absolutely unequal. Deep inequality in the world. Deep inequality. So that world being constructed by Europe after World War II and by the United States has to be dismantled. In all places, they are absolutely building obstacles to different alternatives. And Europe has been intervening in Africa constantly.
Just in the interest of time, because we want to
open
sorry. For the audience.
Okay, so Europe, the end of Europe. Thinking of Patrice to find a language. Yes, of course, but the commodification, as I say, decolonization, the question of commodification is a question, but I think we should not also spend too much time. I always say that when I wrote Decolonial Feminism, I really thought that there will be a T-shirt very quickly, done by women in Bangladesh in all, XS to XL. I am a decolonial feminist. And fortunately, it did not happen, but, it would have been not, surprising. It will not have been surprising. You have, a lot of T-shirts with I am a feminist, after. So the question of colonization through commodification, this necessity to create market, constantly to expand market, to create new desire. I mean, you know all the theory. It's part of the power of the enemy we are confronting. So it's in the practice and in the constant, content we give to the practice that we differentiate ourselves. And they are not, they absolutely understand. We know that one of the big strategies is divide and rule, right? And that's it works. So the way in which even, for instance, neoliberal state understand they have to bring some women, some feminists within, some, gays, some, minority within, to show that the progress and so on. And we know, and so we should not have any expectation. We still sometimes have, we still think that, but we should not have any expectation. This is the question of representation that then, for me, it's more important. And the question of representation was a very important question that is with us since, that was not really resolved, but we are constantly reworking. That is very important. And there is a form of representation that power have understood. They have absolutely very well understood how it works, and they dangle it, and we too often fell for it. So that question of what is our form of representation is, as we know, very much concern for feminists, for black feminists. It's that question that we have constantly to work, I will say. And there are practices, artistic, philosophical practice, but this is really, and it remains at the heart of the struggle. Sorry for being long.
No, thanks so much. I think we could listen to this for a really long time, but I think we should, in view of time, just give the audience the opportunity, if there are any questions, to ask, raise them right now. So we just say the floor is open. And I see one hand immediately popping up over here. Please. Yes, please. The microphone's coming your way. Yeah.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. My name is Kadara Swale from ZMO. My question is that recently, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, called out France for shamelessly continuing to exploit Africa. Is that the first step towards decolonizing Europe? Number two, the overwhelming presence of China in Africa has been written, and people continue to write about it now. Do you think that is a symptom of the total disorder of Europe you are alluding to? Thank you.
Do I answer
Yeah, please just go ahead.
Okay. This question of, the appropriation of vocabulary that the Prime Minister of Italy was a fascist woman, accusing Europe of exploiting Africa, which France, is doing, is part of this appropriation of language today. In the way of a far-right party are defending the people now, are defending rights, and are opposing to the elite. It's a part of the anti-intellectualism, anti-elite, vocabulary. So this is, it's also, as I say, anti-Western rhetoric being weaponized by authoritarian government, which in the meantime exploit and repress in their own country. So this effectively, we are no longer into a binary world. There is not, even when we say the South, the North, we have to be careful because they are in incredibly diversification, effectively, of power today. What the geopoliticians call multipolar, but we don't have to talk like them. And so it's a new situation in which effectively there is a decline of the hegemony of Europe and the United States. But at the same time, they are still very powerful, especially military is powerful. So this play by different governments today, the fact that India also will accuse that people will, I mean, government which are totally authoritarian will talk, will use anti-imperialism, or, this is where we have to be very careful. And as I say, we have to be very rigorous, because we could not fall into that. We're not going to defend these people, there is no need. So we have to constantly be clarified, because it's much more apparently confusing than before, because it's less binary. It's much less binary than it used to be. So she can say that to Macron, and Macron is effectively exploiting Africa, but the Prime Minister of Italy is a fascist and racist, who was, incredible politics against the refugee, but not only the refugee, but also the community of color, of the Afro-Italian, or, or the people living in Italy. So I will not say we, but I, as an anti-racist feminist, I will not fall for what the Prime Minister of Italy is saying. The presence of China in Africa is not so much, this is not, China, this is, I will not call it, it's part of the total disorder of Europe. It's not bringing so much disorder in Europe. European states remain today quite powerful in terms of investment in Africa. And China, there is the fact is, like, capitalism, neoliberal capitalism is no longer just exclusive to Europe and North America. So we live in a world in which different different governments, which have embraced neoliberal capitalism, extraction, and extraction and exploitation, are there. And this country, which we use to assimilate with, more with socialist politics. So this is for us to constantly look at the different forces that are there, see their impact, see how they affect the people living there. Because on the level of government, the arrangement, we can effectively look at how it works, but what we have to look at is, like, who is exploited, how is this exploited, who extract, who benefit from the extraction, what are the circulation of extraction, what are the circulation of exploitation. This is our task.
Perfect. Do we have any more questions? Here in the front row, there was a hand. Here, can we have the microphone here? Maybe just raise it a bit higher.
Thank you so much. Actually, I have a question. I want to start with that in 3 days, which is the 18th of December, International Day of Migrant and Refugees here. And I want to ask you, as I am a refugee here and now I'm living in a continent of non-being, I would say, or as you mentioned before, and also in a country of barbed wire culture, border culture, Frontex culture, police culture, military culture, and nothing more. A place where we as refugees, our grandparents and our parents were the base to build this country, and now sadly we don't have a space to be here. What they think. I want to ask you, this ignorance of this society from the people out of academia to academia, and the ignorance of the government. I want to ask, like when I hear you, I feel this a lot, but I don't know what are we waiting for. Like, what are we waiting to, like, are we waiting for somebody to come and that we follow and we come out of this comfortability? Because in the end of the day, I think it's just us suffering, and yet in a time which is Christmas, everybody's going to their parent, and giving a lot of money for the flights, for present and everything. Meantime, everything, all the work, all the labor work is on migrant and refugees, from gorillas to Amazon to all. Meantime, we are, I don't know if you already know, we are building one of the biggest deportation prison in Berlin, in Brandenburg. Like, when are we realizing that we have to wake up?
Maybe if we have another question, I think we have time for one more question, and then I think I would just give you the final word if there is another question. Okay, over here, please.
Thank you so much for the talk. It's very interesting for me. I'm from Macau, which was a Portuguese colony until 1999, but both China and Portugal said since the 70s it was never the colony. And I have 1,000 questions, but I only asked you one. Do you think that La Réunion is already decolonized in the classical sense of the term? That La Réunion, is it colonized already? Because it's still under French sovereignty. If I Wikipedia it, well, yeah, thank you.
I will just say, Sulti, to answer you. I mean, Europe, I mean, the Europe we are talking about, that Europe, that imperial Europe, there is, as I said, there was a long decades of peace, and still today, mostly, and certain form of good living. And it still rests on, as I say, on exploitation and extraction. For instance, me, I'm really amazed by the fact that how many Europeans take for granted many things that are absolutely not granted for, many people are not entitled to. For instance, you open the tap, water, there is water, and you can even drink the water. This is absolutely exceptional, the polluted air, the fact that you have electricity. So this imperial way of living is really something that will need to be questioned, and that will be very difficult because there is this is an entitlement. I mean, look at the panic already when we know that the winter there will be perhaps no electricity for everyone, and I understand the panic. That's not the point, but the point is on what has been built, that entitlement. I mean, if anyone goes to many places in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in Asia, you don't have that, this entitlement. So we are talking, for me, it's very important to go back constantly to the concrete things, like what is the matter of daily life. What is, when I asked the question, who cleaned the world, it was a very concrete question for me. It was not abstract. It was the fact that no society will function without the daily, invisible, underpaid, overexploited work of women of color everywhere we clean, every places where we circulate. The bank, the insurance, the school, the daycare, the hospice, the hospital, these places. So this, for me, that effectively, we are not waiting for someone, and the point today that we are living in very dangerous time because there is most of the, many states, and not only in Europe but also elsewhere, are effectively neoliberalism is pushing for individual responsibility. If you are in trouble or in poverty, is your fault. And this is being applied. I mean, we have to realize that, we have to understand that there were years of structural adjustment program in what is called the global south that killed the health services, that killed education, all the public services. And this is, Europe is responsible for that, not among with the United States. So the question of what we are living here and how we will transform that, and what you are talking about, barbed wire, and the incredible militarization is part of it's something that we see on a global scale, and how to fight for that. We are not waiting for someone to come, but there is still struggle, and we could be discussing that, but I don't think we will have time. But this is effectively, there are incredible urgency. But as I say, we have also to remind ourselves that there is not a day where there is no resistance and upheaval and insurgency everywhere. So this is what we are looking, and what is leading. I mean, the idea of dignity, of freedom, of equality, people are still ready to die for everywhere in the world. So how to transform this aspiration for dignity? Dignity is and it's not measured, it cannot be measured, and liberty and equality, how we reactivate them to effectively further what I call decolonization, but if this, I'm not a fetishist of word, what I mean is like effectively the liberation or the liberation. Absolutely. We cannot, that world is becoming really uninhabitable and irrespirable for people, for billions of people. So it's a question really of stopping a machine of death. So this is the struggle for me. Réunion is still colonial? Yes, of course. France is a colonial state. France is, France has a lot of territories around the world, in Indian Ocean, Caribbean, Pacific, South America. France, yes, there is state racism, and it's a colonial state, and it's still very intervening very strongly in Africa, still still impose its money in West Africa. Yeah, France is deeply colonial. Colonial not in the same sense than 19th century, but in the term of coloniality, in term of still engaging in processes of racialization. Islamophobia in France today is a very important process to prove that you are French. Being anti-Muslim means that you are French. Has become a part of Frenchness. The obsession with the veil, with the veil woman, is really very defining. Every time there is a woman veil and there is some kind of, like a controversy, there is a reenactment of what is to be French. So that Frenchness is constantly reenacted, reactivated through that. Laïcité and laïcité. I cannot even speak French. And so this is really the redefinition of what is the Frenchness and what is a French Republic is through the opposition to Islam today, very strongly. And this has a long history that could be, discussed. So yes, it's very, very much. I'm constantly amazed by the incredible focalization on the veil. Because I understand how it works, but as I say, it's more has become really a sign of Frenchness. Really, very deeply. It become completely. Even when you had the victory of the Moroccan team at the World Cup, there was constant discussion about what will be the Franco-Moroccan do, and what will become, because there will be danger for the Republic. This has become really, so there is we have to be careful of how this work constantly, being reworked. How Germanness is being reworked today, or Italianness, or, but Frenchness is really through that. Because Europe, this idea that I talk, has to be constantly reenacted. Because it's constantly questioned also. It's constantly challenged. So it has constantly, and as you say, through education, through different, through celebrations, through commemoration, what are the statues, what are the monuments, what are the, all this need to be constantly reenacted. Constantly, through school, movies, everything, because it's never solid, really. You know, it's never, it has to be. And how Frenchness has to be whiteness, what it is, you know, and the narrative that support that. And it's not the same as to be, you know, as to borrow from a new form of public relation. So yes, it's a colonial state. But Europe is colonial in historically, has been built, was built on colonialism. I mean, we could talk about, you know, the taste, you know, the way it was changed, you know, everything. Europe was shaped by its colony. There is a word of Fanon that, you know, that it was a third world that made Europe, you know, that contributed to the idea of Europe. So our world, our daily world is saturated by these afterlives, by the afterlife of colonialism in Europe. Pardon? Oh, no. Sorry. I did not even understand the question. I
was afraid.
No, I identify with Global South as an idea, not as a geography, as we were reminded.
Anyway, Françoise, thanks so much for this amazing lecture, and also thanks to our two wonderful discussants. But I still want to briefly hand back to Abdoulaye Sounaye, who will just say a closing word.
Well, just words of thanks also. And I hope that we have gotten some insight on the whole debate about decolonizing Europe. And I take your invitation to be part of that conversation on decolonizing Europe. And I would like to also reflect on what is my part as somebody coming from Niger and who has crisscrossed the world and now living in Germany. In fact, I would like to ask that question: what can I do for Europe? Or what can I do for decolonizing Europe? In a way, it's a rhetorical question I'm asking, because that decolonizing Europe perhaps is not just about, it's not just the task of Europe as such. It's already happening in many contexts, if I can put it that way. Politically, when I look at what is happening in Mali or in Burkina Faso, I think there is something going on which perhaps even Europe is struggling to understand or to make sense of. So I don't know how that is going to develop, what is coming out of that whole process. But again, thank you for your invitation, thank you for your lecture, and thanks to all of you who have managed to make it here. Those who worked on the front line to make this happen, but also those who worked behind the scenes. And I would like to also thank the museum for hosting this lecture. Rendezvous for the 5th, hopefully next year. Thank you again.